Okay, so today we're starting a series. Well, Blee Netter. Okay, I don't know if it's a series. I'd like to be a series called "How to Cultivate Humility: a Quest for Practical Guidelines." Okay, and what we're covering today will be an introduction from the Rambam mostly, and then the beginning of an analysis of Pirkei Avos 4:4 with the Abravanel. Okay, but let's just go over the objectives. So, um, I'll say obviously humility is a big deal in Judaism, but we'll see that even more from the sources today. But I feel like people talk about humility in abstract, but they don't really we don't I don't really have a sense of how to actually actively work on cultivating humility and getting rid of haughtiness. So the goal of the series as a whole will be twofold. Number one is obviously we should understand it better, understand what humility is on a theoretical level, but also to understand it on a practical level, which is how can we become humble? Okay, is it something like, in other words, I feel like we talk about humility and say it's something that you should strive for, and then there's either this assumption that you know how to get it, or it will somehow automatically result, and I refuse to accept that. I think that there should be guidelines, given the fact that Khazal talk about humility so much, and I want to look for those guidelines. Okay, so that's the series as a whole. And I'm calling this a non-consecutive series because I want to basically dip in and out of this. I don't want to like commit to doing like a 5-part series or whatever. I want to like tackle it this week, and then let's say if something in the parsha or some other topic comes up next week, we'll do that. But if not, we'll go back to this. Okay, just to have this as a background series. Okay, today's plan though is to set up the sugya, to set up the topic. And what I have in mind is first to either learn or review, depending on whether you've learned this before, the Rambam's approach to gaivah, to arrogance and humility, anavah, as set forth in Hilchos Deus, which is the laws of character traits in the Mishneh Torah. I don't know how many of you have done that before, but even if you have done it, it's good to review. I did it last year, and then when I went over it again in preparation for this year, I saw a bunch of new things. So always good to review. Then we're going to start analyzing the main Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that talks about humility, which is Perek Daled, Mishnah Daled. And we're going to use the Abravanel. And this is kind of what started me off on the whole idea for this year, because the Abravanel goes into like very, very specific practical methods that you can use to work on humility. I don't know if we're going to get to the practical methods today, but we're going to start his introduction. And then the other thing also is this is far more open-ended than my other shiurim that I've given on Fridays. Usually I have a full shiur set up and I know exactly where we're going to go. This is an ongoing exploration. So if there are any other questions or dimensions of the topic you want to take up, then I'm fine doing that. And I don't just mean that as an offer. I also mean that as a like, I'm kind of counting on you to share your questions and problems with whatever we learn, because we're in this together. Like, we're investigating this together, and I want it to be like a mutual thing, not just a one-directional thing. That's true of all learning, but here especially, I don't know where we're going. Okay, we're just kind of like on this quest together. Okay, so we will start with the Rambam on gaivah and anavah, and this is really in Hilchos Deus, the second chapter. Now, I was tempted to go through the first chapter because that's where he sets up his whole framework, but then I realized we would be on that all day or for a week. So I'm going to summarize the first chapter, okay, of Hilchos Deus. So in the first chapter, he says, so first of all, Deus in Rambam lingo means character trait. Last year, we worked a lot on why he calls it a dea, because dea comes from the shorish of yud daled ayin, which means knowledge. And in fact, the word dea in other Rishonim, like the Ralbag, dea means like ideas. Rambam uses dea as character traits, whereas the term that we're used to using for character traits is middos, right? What is the literal definition of midah, or literal translation? So the literal translation of midah is measure, okay? And measure implies like a quantitative dimension, and the Rambam does use that term, okay? But the fact that he uses the word dea seems to imply that there is something that it has to do with knowledge, okay? And we can think about that as like a side question about why the Rambam calls these deos, okay? But for now, we'll just treat it as a synonym for character trait. So his theory is that every character trait is a spectrum, okay? with two extremes, which are both bad, and then a middle. So here are a few examples, but really this is true for all of them. So frugal is in the middle between miserly and profligate. Now, if you don't know what all those terms mean, okay, miserly means you cannot bring yourself to spend any money, even when you need to. Profligate means you just overspend and you just, whenever you get money, you spend it and you are unable to save even when you need to. Frugal means that you spend what you need to spend when you need to spend it, but you also save when you need to save, and you can kind of exercise full control over that. Okay, so that's the middle trait, and the other two extremes are bad. Another example, and again, these English terms are kind of hard to deal with. I kind of had to like pick whichever one I thought was the best. Courageous is the middle trait between cowardly and reckless. Cowardly means that you cannot bring yourself to act if there's any sort of threat whatsoever. Reckless means that you just act and you kind of ignore any threats, even when they're a danger to you. Courageous means that you basically exercise bravery and face your fears when it is rational to do so, but you don't take needless risks and you don't cower in fear when action is called for. Okay. I don't know what to call this one. I call it moderation. It's between hedonism and asceticism. Hedonism is when you are overly involved in the world of physical pleasures. Asceticism is when you completely withdraw from the world of physical pleasures, and moderation is when you partake of pleasures to the extent that it makes sense to partake of them. Okay, so this is the Rambam system, and this is true for all the Deos. My basic understanding of it is that the middle trait is the one that has maximum flexibility or fluidity, where you're not pulled to either extreme. So whatever the situation calls for, you're able to do it without any resistance. But if you're in one of the extremes, then you're going to have resistance. I'll give you another example that illustrates that one in a better way. Mercy and cruelty. Okay, so mercy is bad if it's in the extreme, like Shaul HaMelech was merciful on Agag, the king of Amalek, and he didn't kill him when he should have, and that led to bad stuff. And then cruelty is also bad when you don't have mercy on people who need it. But the middle trait, I don't know what you would call that, is when you are able to be merciful when the situation calls for mercy, and cruel or indifferent when the situation calls for cruelty. Okay, so that's the Rambam's way of that he conceives of middos or Deus, and he says we should aim for the middle path in every day. Yeah, Brooke.
Well, I think that, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
I would think that the middle, the balance between mercy and cruelty would be justice.
Justice is good. Yeah. Let me think about that for 1 second. So I'll tell you my only problem with the English word justice and even the Hebrew word mishpat there is, like, justice to me has an implication of applying the law without exception or regardless of exception. So for example, let's say like we say in that a judge shouldn't show favoritism to someone just because he's poor, like he shouldn't feel sorry for someone just because he's poor. And there I feel like that, if anything, is going against mercy and saying, I'm going to apply the law regardless of I'm sorry you're in a situation of poverty, but if you stole money, like you gotta pay it back. But I get what you're getting at, where you're saying you should do what is right. Maybe righteousness might be a better thing along those lines. Yeah. It's a good question. English words are hard when it comes to this. It's easier to just have the concept. Okay, so the Rambam says you should strive for the middle path, but not just something that you should do. He holds it's actually a mitzvah, and the mitzvah is v'halachta bidrachav. You should walk in God's ways, and the Rambam says that God's ways are the terms which the Torah uses to describe Hashem, and those, ordinarily, obviously, we would refrain from describing Hashem in human terms, but the Torah describes Hashem in human terms to point out to us which middos are good for us to follow, and that's an actual mitzvah of the in the Doraisas. Okay, and how does the Rambam say that we should do this? So he has a very behavioristic method, in the sense that, or habit-based method, where he says you should basically find the actions that correspond to the middle path and repeat them again and again and again until they become second nature, and avoid the actions that are on the opposite extremes. So let's say, for example, with let's do another middle trait of generosity. Okay, so generosity is the middle trait in between, I don't know what you would call it, but someone who basically like gives all their possessions away, which is nice for the people who are the recipients, but it's bad for you. And then stinginess is when you don't want to give anything to anybody. So what you should do is if you find yourself on one of those extremes, you should practice acts of generosity until they become easy for you, and then you could do them naturally and you don't have any resistance. Okay, so that's basically a summary of the entire first chapter of the Rambam, okay, which is going to be what we need in order to understand where humility fits in. Okay, any questions on this before we go on? Okay, yeah, Nava.
Yeah, I feel like in the moment sometimes when you have to make these calls, it can be kind of difficult. And so of course it takes practice, but I also feel like, you go in Hashem's ways, but that can also be kind of not subjective, for lack of a better word, but in the moment you don't always have the information that you need, and you sometimes just have to like make a decision.
Okay, good question. So the answer I think lies in the terminology that the Rambam uses for a person who's in the middle. Okay, so I don't know. I would think that well, I'll ask you a question. There's no right answer. There's no like right wrong answer. Okay, but what do you think you would call a person who has achieved the middle path? What Hebrew term would you use to call a person who is like has the middle path and all the character traits?
I'm not sure.
So I would think. Yeah, say again, Brooke.
Balanced, maybe righteous.
Yeah, righteous, right? I would think a tzaddik, right? This is a good term, right? The Rambam calls a person who has the middle path a chacham. Okay, so the question is why? Chachma seems to have to do with thinking and knowledge, not with character traits. Righteousness seems to have to. Tzaddik is a righteous person or a just person. Seems like that has to do with actions. So our theory that we developed last year when we did this chapter, I think, is that the reason why the middle path is called a chacham is because when you are in the middle path and you're not being pulled to one extreme or another, there you are capable of using your mind to assess the situation objectively and to know what is warranted in that situation. So to answer Nava's question, your being in the middle path will not tell you what to do or what not to do. It'll just remove you from subjective personal influences or circumstantial influences. But when you're in the middle, then you can exercise clear thinking and then say, well, what does the Torah demand I do, or what does justice demand I do? And you'll be able to like immediately execute it without being pulled in either direction. So to answer your question, Ava, in the situation, what makes the present moment what makes it hard to know what to do in the present moment is you're pulled in all sorts of directions, internally and externally. But if you've balanced your Deus, then you'll be able to think clearly and act like a chacham,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it means it's the easiest
Yeah.
you can get if you're not pulled in either direction. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
An additional complication, by the way, I'll mention this for the sake of comprehensiveness. The Rambam actually holds that the mitzvah is to be in the middle, but you should incline to one side. Okay. And he calls that person a chassid. So for example, you shouldn't just be in the middle of mercy and cruelty. You should be inclined slightly towards mercy, or you shouldn't just be in the middle of stinginess and like reckless giving. You should be slightly towards the side of reckless giving. And the reason why is twofold. Number one is that there's something that we call the Deus Drift, which is it's impossible to stay in the middle. You're constantly drifting one way or the other. So you have to if you've ever gone grocery shopping and you have one of those grocery carts where the wheel is slightly inclined. So when you're pushing it forward, you're being pulled to the other side. You have to compensate by inclining it towards the other side. Okay. So that's one reason why you should err on one side. But the other reason is, of the Deos, there are always going to be Deos that are more in line with Hashem's will than others. So for example, Hashem does sometimes want us to be cruel, but more often he wants us to be merciful, or he sometimes wants us to be stingy, to not give when, stuff, but he more often than not wants us to be giving, So Rambam holds you should really err on the side of the ones that are more in line with Hashem's will and more on the side that you are not drifting towards in order to overcorrect, So it is a more delicate thing than I depicted in the summary. And it is more difficult, as Nava acknowledged. Okay, So now we get to chapter 2. So this we're going to read the first 3 halachos because this is really preparing the ground for understanding arrogance and haughtiness. Okay, and arrogance and humility. I'm going to read this in English until we get to the part where the Hebrew is important. Those who are physically ill, okay, choli haguf, people who have sicknesses of the body, taste the bitter as sweet and the sweet as bitter. Some of these sick individuals desire and crave as food things which are inedible, such as dirt and coal, and hate healthy foods such as bread and meat, all according to the severity of the illness. Now, we do have terminology for this in modern lingo. So I think the term for there is a disease where people will eat inedible stuff. I think it's called pica, right? Like people like eat like chew like paper or whatever, and then people who, I mean, he says hate, okay, but like we would say, for example, that someone who has an eating disorder where they don't eat foods, let's say like anorexia nervosa, where they don't eat foods that really their body needs, then that's what we would that's what the Rambam's talking about. He uses the word hatred because he means that they don't do this. It doesn't mean you hate eating. It means that you are not, you're not attracted to the food that you actually like should be eating. Okay. So too people whose souls are sick. Now, sicknesses of the soul are, we have, okay, you'll hear from the Rambam's description here. Sicknesses of the soul fit into 2 modern categories. Okay, some sicknesses of the soul we would call mental illnesses. Okay, because soul is in this context like your non-physical part, right? But other so and in cases of mental illness, we wouldn't pass value judgments. But then other cases of sicknesses of the soul, we would call character defects. For example, we don't call, like if someone is just extremely like if someone is a spoiled brat, okay, we don't call that a mental illness. We call that a character defect, or if someone is just a mean person, we don't call that a mental illness. We call it a character defect. But if someone is depressed, is clinically depressed, we call that a mental illness, So this doesn't quite translate cleanly into the modern terms we have. So just kind of like keep both those concepts in mind. Okay. So too people whose souls are sick. Misavim ve'ohavim hadeos haraus. They desire and love bad character traits. V'sonin hader hatova, and they hate the good path. Misatzlim lelechasba, and they are lazy or in conflict about following it. V'hi kaveda aleim l'ma'od. It weighs heavily upon them. L'fi choliam, according to their the severity of their sickness. So he's going to give some examples. Oh, sorry, not yet. He's going to quote Yeshayahu. Thus, Yeshayahu says about such people, Hoi ha'omrim l'ra tov l'tov ra. Woe unto those who call the bad good and the good bad. Samim choshech la'or v'or l'choshech. They make darkness into light and light into darkness. Samim mar l'matok u'matok l'mar. They make bitter sweet and sweet bitter. V'aleihim nemar, and about these people, Mishlei says, ha'ozim orchos yosher l'lechas b'darchei choshech. They abandon the ways of uprightness to walk on the paths of darkness. Okay, so that's obviously passing value judgments. Okay, so what do you do? Umahi tkanas kol hanafashos. What do you do if you're sick in your soul? So he says, Yelhu etzel hachachamim. You should go to the wise. Shehim rofe hanafashos. They are doctors of the soul. Okay, or if you want to put this in modern terms, mental health professionals. Okay, v'yirapu choliam b'deos shemalam dimosam, and they will heal your sicknesses. Sorry, they will heal your character sicknesses with by teaching you. Okay, ad shiachzirim l'derech hatova, until they return you to the good path. Okay, now the Rambam says basically go to the experts and they will heal you through teaching you. Now, when we were analyzing this in my Rambam share last year, it was unclear whether the Rambam is going to give you a remedy, okay? But it's unclear whether the Rambam is saying that this remedy that he's about to give is the only remedy, or if he means go to the mental health professionals in your time and like they will apply the latest and greatest methods according to like knowledge of the soul, In other words, the Rambam is going to prescribe a method which he clearly thought was the best method, but I think he might be open to the fact that now we have other methods of healing illnesses of the soul, which would also be useful. Okay, so here's what he says. But he gives one little condemnation, and this I think is a condemnation. Let's say you recognize your own bad character traits and you do not go to the wise to heal them. Alehem Amar Shlomo Umusar Evilim Bazu. So Shlomo would say about such people, they hate, fools hate discipline. Okay, meaning that no value judgment if you have a mental illness, but if you have a mental illness and you refuse to go and get help, that's a big problem. Okay, then you're gonna fall into the realm of fools who hate discipline, and you got to go get help, professional help. Okay, so how does the Rambam say that you heal these things? He says like this: what is their remedy? Let's say you have an anger problem, okay, anger management. Omrin lo, the Chachamim will say to him, Lahan asmo, to behave in such a way, im huka v'kulal, that if someone hits you or curses you, lo yargish klal, you shouldn't have any feeling in reaction. Follow this path for a very long time until the anger is uprooted. Okay, so you train yourself to basically not react. Okay, whether it's counting to 10 or whether it's like keeping a stoic face, stoic with a lowercase s, not a uppercase s. So then you should behave that way for a long time, and then you will not react. And if you've ever had like a, I feel like people have problems like this a lot with their younger or older siblings, like you'll find that if you react, then it just makes you further entrenched in your own anger, but if you just ignore it, then the problem can go away, or at least be diminished, and then you can get it under control. Okay, or on the internet, right? They say don't feed the trolls, like if someone like is always like making comments or whatever, just don't give in, don't react, and then you just won't care about it as much about it. Okay, and if he is haughty, now take a note of this one, okay, because we're gonna have to come back to this. He should behave in a very degraded manner, sitting below everyone, meaning like in the olden days, they would have like, seats where the prominent people would sit, and then they would have seats where like the lower class people would sit. So sit in the places, in lowly places. Behave in a degraded manner, sitting below everyone. Wear worn out clothing that degrades the people who wear it, because and other things like that. Until you've uprooted haughtiness from your heart. Until you return to the middle path, which is the good path. And when you hit upon the good path, then you should follow it for the rest of your life. Okay, so those are examples, but now he universalizes. That's what you should do for all your character traits. If you're on one extreme, go to the opposite extreme. And conduct yourself in this for a long time, until you get to the good path, until you get to the good path, which is the middle path in each and every day. Now, before we go on to talk about haughtiness, can we explain like what the logic is behind doing this? In other words, the first method the Rambam gave before he talked about the sicknesses of the soul, he said basically like practice the good behaviors until it becomes second nature. That just seems like regular habit formation, like do it until you get into the habit of doing it, right? This seems to be that plus something else, meaning obviously if you are on one extreme and you go to the opposite extreme and you behave in that way, then you'll set yourself up to develop those good habits. But in other words, is there more to it than that? Like, can we explain why you should go to the opposite extreme in order to cure your bad path? In other words, why not just go to the middle path? And let's say like I'm very hot, let's not use haughtiness. Let's say I'm very I'm trying to use it. Let's say I'm very miserly, right? And I can't bring myself to spend money. Maybe I should train myself to be frugal and like spend money when the situation calls for it until I can become frugal. Why go all the way to the extreme of like spending a lot of money until I get to the middle? Why do you have to go to the extreme? Yeah.
I was going to say, I kind of disagree with that, because to me that seems like an extreme, and you could potentially be setting yourself up for failure.
Exactly.
So to answer the question, I would think like maybe to show yourself that you're capable of it, and then if you slip up, you end up in the middle, as opposed to if you strive for the middle, you end up all the way back where you started.
Okay, good. So I think the two prongs of your answer are the two answers, which is You said to show yourself that you're capable of it. So I'm going to say the same thing, but just in a slightly different way, which is part of the problem of character traits is you identify with them. Okay. And in fact, I think a lot of people view their emotions as themselves. Okay. Now, Judaism obviously has a different perspective that we hold yourself is really your tselem elokim, is really the thinking, truth-seeking part of you, and your emotions are really part of your body, which is why in Olam Haba, according to the Rambam, where it's purely non-physical, you don't have your personality because your personality is not the real you, but people identify with their emotions and with their personality traits. And when you identify with them, it makes it hard to give up because you feel, well, this is just who I am. This is the type of person I am. So if you are just going to the middle and you're still retaining some elements of that character trait, it's easy for you to be anchored in your prior identity. But if you go all the way to the opposite extreme, you're breaking identification with that character trait. And then you realize, oh, I can survive without this, or I am capable of being a completely different person, or I can, I can have a self-image that is the reverse of what I had before. And then once you break from your addiction to your old self-image, then you can go to the middle in a much easier way. So let's play through the example here. Like, let's say you were a person who like, okay, I'll use a personal example with the frugality thing, right? Is like when I was growing up, my parents never really like sat down and talked to me about how to spend money responsibly. So when I started making my own money, I defaulted to this radical thing where I just don't spend money on anything I don't need to spend money on, and I've been trying to work on that and to be able to spend money on things that are not bare necessities, but are like nice. So what I'm doing is I am like forcing myself to spend money on stuff that I might not have ordinarily bought before. So like I bought a mattress, a nice quality mattress for my bed, which I have been sleeping on a bad mattress for like the last 19 years, or like I bought like I guess I don't have this in the background here, but my Bruce Lee plaques, for the wall to remind me of like the core of my philosophy of learning, So what I'm doing by doing this is like trying to break the identity of being someone who doesn't spend money on anything that's not absolutely essential. And then once I do that, now I can get back to this middle stage of flexibility, where I can like be frugal and spend money on stuff that like that makes sense to spend money on, and save when it makes sense to save. The second part of Nava's answer is the backup plan or the failsafe, which is that if you are on one extreme and you strive to the middle and then you slip, you're going to go back to the extreme. But if you overshoot it and go all the way to the opposite extreme and then you fail, you'll fail into the middle, or there's a greater chance that you'll fail into the middle, So like easy example there is like, let's say you are an extreme introvert who's afraid of social situations. Okay. And not all introverts are afraid of social situations, but let's say like you are you just never go out to like social events because you can't make yourself like talk with people, So you might think, oh, I should go to the middle, which is I should go out to an event, but like and that'll make me more social. But what'll happen is you'll just withdraw into the corner and you won't talk to people, So maybe what you should do is do something extreme, like do improv, or like something where like you're going to be like forced to act in a way that is extremely extroverted. So there, if you revert to your introvert tendencies, you'll still be like in an extroverted scenario, something like that. Okay, so both good answers, Nava. All right, so I think that's good for the setup. Okay, now we are finally ready, unless there are more questions. Yeah, Brooke.
I was thinking that also another reason for why you'd want to go to the opposite extreme is because you kind of experience both extremes in order to understand what the middle of those two would be.
That's a good point. That is a good point. Right. So if you have been on one extreme for your whole life, then your knowledge is not just theoretical. Like we know that there is such a thing like as extroversion, or as people who can't, people who spend lavishly on themselves, but unless you've you have experiential knowledge, it's not going to be real to your emotions. So that's actually another good answer, which I did not think of last year, which is you need to get experiential knowledge of the other extreme so that you can better find the middle and experience the middle and then know what the middle is. That's a good answer. Okay. Having said that, now we're ready for arrogance and humility. Okay. Rambam says like this. Deus There are character traits which it is prohibited to conduct yourself in the middle path. Okay. Ella yisrachik ad hakate ha'akar, but you have to go all the way to the other extreme. The who, and they are gaivah halev. Okay, gaivah halev literally means being high in your heart, but we translate it as haughtiness, arrogance, egotism. Okay, so one of these is haughtiness. She'ein derech hatova shihi adam anav bilvad. Don't just be humble, an anav. Ella shihi shval ruach. You should be low in spirit. V'tiye rucho nimucha limaod. Your spirit should be exceedingly low. Okay. Ulefikach nemar b'Moshe Rabbeinu. That's why it says b'Moshe Rabbeinu anav me'od v'lo nemar anav bilvad. It says that Moshe was very humble, not just humble. Ulefikach tzivu chachamim, and therefore the chachamim commanded, and they said, and this is going to be the Pirkei Avos that we start analyzing. Me'od ma'od havei shval ruach. Be very, very humble. V'od amru. They also said, shekol hamagbi alibo. Anyone who's haughty, kafar be'ikar, has denied God's existence. Shnemar, as it says, V'ram levavecha v'shachachta es Hashem lokecha. Your heart became haughty and you forgot Hashem your God. The Od Amru, and they also said, Bishamta, someone should be ostracized or put into excommunication. De'isbe gasos haruach, if you have haughtiness, afilu miksasa, even a little bit of haughtiness. Okay, so these are all very extreme statements. Okay. Now, just I'm not going to read the other one. The other exception is anger. The Rambam says that you should go to the opposite extreme of anger and never be angry at all. If anything, if you need to be angry to discipline people, you should just act angry, but you should not be angry inside. Okay, so now that we're on our topic, okay, what are the questions that you have on those last two things in the Rambam? So let's read it again. There are character traits that you're prohibited to act on with the middle path. You should distance yourself to the opposite extreme. So one of them is haughtiness, for it is not good for a person to merely be humble. Rather, you should be low of spirit, and spirit should be exceedingly low. That's why it says a Moshe Rabbeinu very humble and not merely humble. And the sages said, be very, very lowly of spirit. If your heart is haughty, you've denied God's existence. And anyone who's haughty should be ostracized, even if it's just a little bit. Now, unlike in my normal shiurim where I preload the questions, here let's list the questions together. Okay, so tell me what questions you have, but let me just get my water bottle. I'll be right back. Okay, think about questions. Okay. So what questions do we have to ask on the Rambam?
So I have two questions. One, which we kind of answered, but I think it'd still be worth bringing up, which is how do we practically do this? How do we practically get to the point of humility? And also, how do we get to this point, but without completely lacking like self-respect, for lack of a better word? Or how do we not like just completely suppress ourselves and show and have the mindset of like, I'm worth nothing, you know, because like, do you think there's a value in like some sort of self-respect?
Right. Okay, good questions. Okay. So one question is going to be, okay, well, let me, okay. So the first question you asked, which is how do you practically do this? So that is the, what do you call it? That's the overarching mission of the entire series, right? Okay. So I'm not going to ask that, but I'm going to ask a different version of it. How would the Rambam say that you practically do this? That you practically get rid of haughtiness, based on what we've read?
To go to the opposite extreme.
And what would that look like?
Like being very lowly.
Well, that's the goal, but he's saying, so again, his whole method is do actions that correspond to the dea that you want to try to get. So what actions would the Rambam suggest that you do?
Like maybe giving up like, I don't know, materialistic possessions or not like uplifting yourself.
So you're right, but we actually read the answer. Okay. Yeah, Brooke?
to disgrace yourself in front of others.
Exactly, right? So we read this actually when we went through the Rambam. Before he started talking about haughtiness, he said, and if he is haughty, he should behave in a very degraded manner, sitting below everyone, wearing worn out clothing that degrades its wearers, and other things like this, until his haughtiness is uprooted from him, right? So that's what the Rambam is prescribing for this, okay? But the question is like this, okay? If the Rambam says this is how you cure haughtiness, okay, like wear worn out clothing and do degrading things, and if the Rambam says that every person should always strive to be extremely low-spirited. So is the Rambam suggesting that we all just wear ugly clothing and sit below everyone and like do degrading actions? Right? In other words, I'm taking your question, Nava, which is, let me type it out, okay? Which is like this, okay? How do we get rid of I'm just gonna use the Hebrew term gaivah, okay? Because it's a short word to type. Okay, gaivah, right? Instead of gova lever haughtiness. Okay, how do we get rid of gaivah? So according to the Rambam, according to what the Rambam wrote in Halacha 2, okay, we should wear worn out clothing, sit beneath everyone, and act in degrading ways. But should every person really do this all the time? Right? Sounds like that would follow from the Rambam, right? Is you uproot haughtiness by acting in a degrading way. Everyone should never be haughty, and you should always go to the opposite extreme. But does the Rambam really, like, I just don't think that this is really what we do. I mean, there's no halacha book that says every single human being, every single Jew is obligated to wear worn out clothing. I've just never seen such a thing, you know? So how do we reconcile that? And then now the second question, does that make sense as a question?
Just missing, what are we defining exactly as gaivah? And I had another question is, there must be something good about it if God put it into our, into our personalities, into our DNA, I guess.
Okay, so let's actually ask that question first. Okay, what exactly is gaivah, right? What's the definition? Okay, then we have Nava's first question, and then Nava's second question, and what Naomi's saying right now. I think I'm going to put them together, okay, which is like this. Nava said, like, so should we really get rid of all gaivah? Wouldn't that be like mentally unhealthy? Okay, if we viewed ourselves as absolutely nothing, okay, or didn't God give us ego for a reason? Now, this is a better question than you think, okay, because and I don't think we're going to get to this today. There's actually a machlokus in the Gemara. This is a funny machlokus, okay? So the machlokus is, should you have 1/64th amount of gaivah? Okay, which means picture on the spectrum of gaivah, divide it into 64 portions. Okay, so 64 is the person who's like completely haughty, and then 0 is Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, so the question is, where should we aim for? So there's a machlokus in the Gemara about whether we should aim at one notch away from 0, so you should have 1/64th of gaivah, or whether you should have none. So it's actually a machlokus, okay? And so Nava, your intuition is in line with the side that says you should have 1/64th. And in fact, in one of the Mefarshim that I was reading last night, then who was this? Rabbeinu Yonah says, according to that side, he says, if you didn't have any gaivah, then you basically be like an animal, you know, and that's bad. You know, so therefore that side says you should have 1/64th, and then the other side says no, you should have none. Okay, so we'll leave that as a question. Okay, so that's a good question. All right, any other questions on the Rambam? Yeah, Brooke. Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks. I was thinking, well, two things. One is when he was talking about anger.
Yeah.
I guess it's kind of a tangent, but he said you should never be angry, and I was thinking. Humans have passion in order to motivate us toward action.
Yeah.
So I think anger, even in small amounts, can be very useful to start things and do things and push people to and motivate them to do action. Especially like as someone with ADHD, like I don't know if Moshe had problems with executive dysfunction, but like it's like you kind of need to, you know, use emotions in order to motivate you to start stuff.
Right.
And anger is a powerful motivator. So I disagree with the Rambam. Sorry.
Okay, so that is a good question, and I do agree that it is not on our topic. But if you want, I'll try to remember to send you. I can't remember how many shiurim I did on it last year. I think I did at least 2 shiurim on anger. That if you're interested in the Rambam stance on anger, then you could listen to it. But cool. Yeah. Okay.
I'm gonna send you a text. So
thank you very much. That is very helpful. That will motivate me. Remind me. Okay. Any other questions on what the Rambam said about arrogance and humility?
Yes.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. I was thinking if you completely degrade yourself in front of other people, they're probably going to have an inaccurate understanding of who you are or what you stand for.
Okay, good. So let us, I'm going to actually, okay, you know what? What we're going to do is like this. We're going to split this question into 3 sub-questions. Okay. So sub-question 1 is, wouldn't it be mentally unhealthy if we got rid of all gaivah? Okay. Secondly, didn't God give us ego for a reason? Okay. And third is, isn't having some gaivah necessary for how others relate to us? Okay. And I can't quote the pasuk because I don't know where it is, but I believe that this was one of Shaul HaMelech's problems also, which is that he was a king, but he didn't have the proper amount. He didn't carry himself with he was too humble in terms of the way that he appeared to others. So people like trampled all over him, you know, or what are some other examples of people who have this? Like if you're in any leadership position, you can't just let people walk all over you. You know, another example is like a Rav, you know, needs to instill a certain amount of respect for the sake of Torah. You know, if he lets himself be completely like trampled, then it's a degradation to Torah, you know? So there are other reasons why you should, you know, seemingly like have gaivah, you know? Okay, good. What else? Okay, so I'm going to ask a question, which I think is a fundamental question, but we'll have to explore this. Okay, which is, why should we strive to be shval ruach? Okay, which again, shval ruach is like the extreme. The way the Rambam has it, by the way, is gova lev is on one side, is haughty, anav is the middle, and then shval ruach is all the way at the other end. So why should we strive to be shval ruach? Okay, because that is ideal and intrinsically valuable, or is it out of extreme precaution? Okay, in other words, like, is it a perfection, like an actual virtue or perfection, to be low-spirited, or is it just gaivah is so bad that you have to go to the other extreme because we're worried that you're going to have any sort of any amount of gaivah, you know? Yeah. And then lastly, yeah, Brooke.
Why does he not just say that you should start by straying to the extreme and then slowly drift toward the middle? Like, why does he just advise, like, just stay there?
Yeah, right. So with all other Deus, he does say that you should go to the extreme and then come back to the middle. Here he says you should stay there, and I think that, to me, could support that second possibility, which is the drift is so strong that you have to be constantly going upstream, fighting upstream, because otherwise you're going to be like, in other words, with other Deus, it is possible to be in the middle and kind of stay there and only like nudge yourself a little bit. Here it could be that it's so strong of a pull that like you have to like constantly fight and be all the way at the other end, you know? So I think that's I think your question is a good one. I think it's part of this question here. All right, I'm gonna ask another one on what the Rambam said, which is, why what does the Rambam mean when he says, and it's not the Rambam, let's say, what do Khazal mean? What do Khazal mean when they say that anyone who is haughty, it is as if they denied God's existence, right? That sounds extreme. Okay. Yeah. And truthfully, like, we should ask a more primary question. Okay. What's so bad about gaivah? Right. I mean, that's just a very, very general question here. Okay. And I guess, again, this will be the whole the whole series, but what's so bad about gaivah?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, like, why this middos specifically? Why is there such like a heavy connotation with it? Okay,
good. Yeah. Okay, so this is actually a good segue into the last part of what we're going to do for today, which is the we're going to start Pirkei Avos, okay, and start the Abravanel's commentary, okay. So the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that is about gaivah, the Rambam quoted in part, but the other part is more dramatic, okay. So Rabbi Levitas Ish Yavne Omer, this is Pirkei Avos Daled Daled, Me'od Me'od Hevei Shval Ruach, you should be very, very low spirited. Shetikvas Enosh Rima. For the hope of mortal man is worms. Okay, so in other words, you should be very humble because one day you're going to be eaten by worms. Okay, yeah, that's a pleasant thought. So I forgot to make let's just ask questions on this before we go to the Abravanel's thing here. Okay, so what questions would you have on this Mishnah?
I guess death is all of our fates, and so to lift yourself above somebody else doesn't make sense because nobody.
Wait, are you giving an explanation or a question?
I'm not sure, honestly.
Okay. I just wasn't sure where you're going. So continue then. We'll see.
Yeah, I guess my thoughts on that are, so we're all gonna die in the end of our lives, and so to uplift ourselves above anybody else doesn't make any sense because we're not born with status, or we're not born above anyone else.
Right. So that sounds like a good explanation.
Got it.
Yeah, right. Okay. So that is a good explanation. Let's get the questions first, okay? So let me phrase the question that you're answering, okay, which is hold on. What exactly is Rabbi Levitas's reasoning? Okay. In other words, how should the fact that we'll be worm food make us shval ruach? You have to reverse engineer your answer, right? Any other questions? I have a couple more, which you could theoretically say are part of that question, but. So my question is like this, and maybe this is not a fair question, but how does this strategy differ, meaning worm food, differ from the general strategy of thinking about death? Okay, in other words, it is a fairly common theme in Khazal and in Koheles that realizing that you're going to die, and in fact, earlier in Pirkei Avos, someone else, Akavi ben Mahalalo, says, think about where you're going. You're going to a place of worms and maggots, but like, actually, I guess that fits into the question here. In other words, why focus on worms? Okay. Or what does he mean by the hope of mortal man is worms? In other words, this is a much more specific thing than like, oh, one day you're going to die. Like, no, you're going to be eaten by worms. What is that? What does that add above just the thing about death? Yeah, Brooke.
So I was thinking that if you just say like one day you're gonna die, whatever, but we're a lot of, I don't know, Jewish thought and also just thinking in general is our bodies are sacred and special and important. And this is
Oh,
saying
good.
your body is going to be eaten by worms. So
Yeah.
all of like it's specifically separating the physical from
Yeah.
the physical, and saying all of the current physical things you treasure like won't matter. And it's
Yeah.
using this very stark example of like the body being disgraced in its most vulnerable state.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to actually piggyback on that and ask a question based on that. Okay. Which is Judaism holds that the essence of a person is their non-physical part, non-physical soul, not their body. Right. So if so, why should we care about what happens to our body? Okay. In other words, or another way of asking the question is, wouldn't a person on a higher level be undisturbed by the thought, by this thought? You know, like, yeah, if you're totally attached to your body, then this is going to affect you. But it seems like the higher level you're on, the less you're going to care about what happens to your body, especially after your death, you know? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Is that it? I think that's it for now, unless we have other questions that come up. Okay. So we're going to start the Abravanel's commentary. We're not going to go in depth. He's going to quote a lot of Khazals. Okay. And I want to not get bogged down in the details. Okay. So you'll see where he goes in a second. Okay. So the first thing, his commentary actually begins by, one of the things the Abravanel does in his Chumash commentary is he connects, in his Avos commentary is he explains the order of the Mishnah. So this was Mishnah 4 in chapter 4. Mishnah 3 said this: Ben Azai used to say, do not disparage any person and do not be dismissive of anything, for there's no person without his time of utility, nor anything without its place. Okay, so that was the Mishnah before this. Now here's the Abravanel. Since Ben Azai said, do not disparage any person, and he gave as a reason, for there's no person without his time, meaning a time when he'll be of use to you, Rabbi Levitas's mind wasn't cooled off. I don't know exactly what he means by his mind wasn't cooled off, but it means like he didn't like that. For a person shouldn't only be humble and lowly and not disparage his fellows out of hope for utility on account of the harm that might result therefrom. If he did this, he would be cultivating this virtue of humility for its practical utility and not for its intrinsic value as a virtue. So in other words, what he's saying is like this, is Ben Azai says, don't disparage your fellow man because you might need him someday. And Rabbi Levitas is like, what do you mean? Why are you giving that as the reason? You shouldn't disparage your fellow man because it's bad to do that. You know, like you should honor, you know, your fellow. So you, Ben Azai, are just giving utilitarian reasons. And this is kind of how I view the difference between Mishleh's approach to this topic and Pirkei Avos' approach. Mishleh would say, in fact, Mishleh does say, you know, lifnei shever gaon, pride goes before breaking, you know, that if you are haughty, you're going to suffer consequences. But Pirkei Avos is focused more on developing good middos for their own sake, you know, or because they're intrinsically valuable. Okay, so the Abravanel goes on, therefore, he said, it is not proper to do so for this reason, but rather one should be lowly of spirit at the utmost extreme, very, very, not out of hope of benefit or fear of harm, but only because the hope of mortal man is worms. So how could he be haughty? That's like what Nava was saying. Like, given the fact that you're going to be food for worms, how could you say that you're greater than this? You know, it is like the verse. Now, he's quoting from Hebrew poetry, which is much more poetic in Hebrew than in my English translation. Echa ma'ale rima avakesh umachartie rima achosi. Okay, how can I, who will raise up worms, ask for anything when tomorrow the worm will be my sister? I must be some reference here. I don't really get. Okay. Then he goes on. Now, this is the part where he's just going to give you an onslaught of statements of Khazal about humility. So we're going to read through them fast because we're not going to analyze every single one. Okay. The sages have praised the virtue of humility exceedingly in saying that wisdom has been made a crown for her head and humility as a slipper for her foot. That is a shoe. As it is written, the beginning of wisdom is fear of Hashem. From here, it is evident that fear of Hashem is greater than wisdom and is the cause of its existence. As it is stated, fear of Hashem is a consequence of humility. In other words, you will find fear of Hashem on the hems and the heels of humility. Onward. Furthermore, Khazal said that this matter is written in the Torah, repeated in the Nevi'im, and repeated again in the Ksuvim. Any place where you find the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there you will find his humility. Now it goes through a bunch of examples. It is written in the Torah, the great, mighty, and awesome God. And it is written right afterwards, God does justice for the orphan and the widow. So right after saying God is great, it says he's with the lowliest of the people. It is repeated in the Nevi'im. For thus said the exalted and most high, who dwells forever, and holiness is his name. And afterwards it is written, he is with the crushed and the low-spirited. Again, God is on high, and he's with those who are low. It is repeated again in the Ksuvim, as it is written, extol he who rides upon the highest heaven with his name, Ka. And it is written afterwards, the father of orphans and the judge of widows. The root of this discipline is from the Torah, which praises the master of prophets, that's Moshe Rabbeinu, who is more perfected than any other created being. And the man Moshe was humble more than any person on the face of the earth. Rambam says this better, by the way. Okay, this is I'm just going to quote from the Rambam here. Moshe was the most perfected human being who ever existed. So he was perfected in his intellect, perfected in all of his middos, and he was the greatest navi who ever existed, right? And whoever will exist. Yet, the one time that God praises Moshe Rabbeinu to other people, what does he say about Moshe? Is Va'ish Moshe anav mikol ha'adam. Anav me'od mikol ha'adam. That Moshe was more humble than any man on the face of the earth. So the fact that he had all these qualities, but is praised for his humility, is really significant. Okay. Therefore, Khazal were strict with the sin of haughtiness. As they said, any person who has haughtiness, it is as if he worshipped avodah zarah. As it is stated, so here's the drasha, every haughty heart is an abomination of Hashem, and it is written elsewhere, you shall not bring an abomination into your house. And that was talking about avodah zarah, so it's comparing haughtiness to avodah zarah. Furthermore, they said that if a person is haughty, it is as if he denied Hashem. As it is stated, your heart will become haughty and you will forget Hashem, your God. And they stated elsewhere that the sin of haughtiness is like someone who violates all the prohibited sexual relations. As it is stated, every haughty heart is an abomination of Hashem, and it is written, for they did all those abominations. Okay, so again, it uses the word abomination for araios and abomination for haughtiness. Furthermore, they said, anyone who has haughtiness is fit to be chopped down like an asherah. An asherah is an idolatrous tree. As it is written, those who are tall in stature shall be chopped down. And it is written here, their asheros you shall chop down. So it uses the word chop down for people who are haughty and for asheros. And at the resurrection of the dead, those who are haughty will not be resurrected. They said, every person who has haughtiness, his dust will not stir. As it is stated, wake up and sing, you who dwell in the dust. One who became dust during his lifetime, meaning if you were haughty and you're like dust, will wake up and sing, but everyone who has haughtiness, the Shekhinah will bemoan him. As it is stated, and the one who on high makes himself known from afar. They said that sara'as is a punishment for those who are haughty. As it is stated, the se'es, the sapachas, and the baheres, those are three types of sara'as. And se'es only means arrogance, as it is stated in Hebrew, gavhos hanisos, which literally means high hills. So it's associated, it's a play on words, that those hills who are high and people who are haughty, it is as if it says one who is haughty will suffer a sapachas. Okay. So that's the Abravanel's onslaught of statements of Khazal. So the question I have, again, if we wanted to, we can analyze all of these things, but like the general question I have is like this. Okay. The Abravanel quotes all these statements of Khazal, okay, in praise of humility and in degradation of haughtiness. Okay, what are we supposed to get from this onslaught of quotations? And the reason why I'm asking that is, like, you know, Khazal intended us to analyze each of these things on its own. Okay, you know, that's what we do with every midrash. But the Abravanel doesn't bother to explain all of this. Okay, he goes later on. He's going to go at length on Rabbi Levitas, but presumably the Abravanel doesn't want us to analyze each of these things on our own, or he doesn't expect us to. So the question is, like, what are we supposed to get out of just this huge, like, avalanche of quotations? You know, if we're not getting the ideas. And I'm making an assumption there. I'm assuming that he's saying that, like, ideally you should analyze this each one on its own, but that's not what he's going to aim at right now. Okay, were there any other questions that struck you other than, like, what does he mean by that and what does he mean by that? You know, any other questions on the Abravanel in general? because if not, I think this is a good stopping point. Okay, because what we're going to do next is, or the plan is as follows. Okay, we have our questions on the Rambam, and we have our questions on the Mishnah. And here's a sneak peek of the Abravanel for next week, or I assume next week, next in the series. Okay, he is going to go and he's going to say that there are 7 types of haughtiness, and then he's going to give you specific strategies for combating those forms of haughtiness. So, for example, the first one he goes into is people who are haughty because of their beauty. Okay, and he gives strategies for that. Then people who are haughty because of their family prominence. Then people who are haughty because of their money. Okay, so and he's going to go through and give us these practical ways of breaking it down. And what I would like to do is understand those practical techniques and then go back to the Rambam and to Khazal and use that to like understand haughtiness and arrogance in general, or haughtiness and humility in general. Okay, sounds like a plan. All right, and again, this is all bli neder. And we might not even continue this next week. Okay, it depends on if I find something else that we want to do. But this is our intro to arrogance and humility, and hopefully we will come back and answer these questions at some point in the future. Okay.
Hey,
Yes.
I have a question. Okay, this is
Sure.
about the bleed neder stuff, if I can ask it.
Yeah.
When you say something, you've already made a neder, and then you say bleed neder afterwards, you can do that? How's that?
Well, if you've already made the neder, then you can't do it. But like if you say bli
No, like-
neder, well,
We always say, we say the statement, we say, I'm going to do blah, bli neder, but shouldn't you say bli neder before you make the statement?
oh, I see what you're asking. Yeah. So what I
So
okay,
I do that too. So.
yeah, this is my own understanding. This is not psak. Is that I assume that we get into the habit of saying the phrase bli neder, so that when we say the commitment, we have in mind bli neder. Essentially, it's having in mind to not take it on as a neder, and then we just say bli neder afterwards, so that we get into the habit of thinking bli neder when we say the statement. If that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Like in other words, like this, just to give
right,
a
because
practical
we're
example.
really saying. So if you didn't say it, if you didn't say bli neder, it would still not. Would it still not be a neder because of what you were thinking when you said it?
Yeah, my understanding again. This is not a psak, but my understanding is if I make a statement about the future and I have in mind that it's not a neder, then it's not a neder, you know. But if I don't have anything in mind, then it is a neder. So my fear, what I'm saying is, you say bli neder so that you'll get into the habit of having in mind not to make nedarim when you make statements that have to do with the future. Yeah.
So okay, so like basically you want to think, you really want to try to get yourself into like thinking before,
Exactly.
or taking, you're being more seriously.
And so you're right, by the way, Naomi, that I think it would probably be better if we got into the habit of saying bli neder first. That'd be even better.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what? I always have questions. Is sometimes like I think of doing something.
Yeah.
Like it's a fleeting thought. I'm like, and then I'm like, and then I think of the practical thing. Because sometimes you get like motivated to do something. So is thinking it in your head, or do you have to have a?
It's saying it. So my understanding is that it's verbalizing it, which creates the neder. And if you have in mind for it to not be a neder, then it doesn't create the neder, but if you say it stam, like without having anything in particular in mind, and it's a mitzvah, then it's a neder. But just thinking it alone is not going to be.
I see.
Fleeting thoughts don't
action
create.
Can also create.
Actions can also do it, right? Like for the classic example is like if you do a chumrah, astringency 3 times without having anything in mind, then you take it upon yourself as a neder, Yeah. Yep.
Without having in mind that you're not
exactly.
Not
yeah. If you have in mind that you're not doing it as a neder, then you're good. Then that's
fine.
My
goodness. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, the neder is a very complicated area, and this is why I always ask my posek whenever I have a nedarim question, because it's an extremely complicated area, and there's a lot of subtleties here. So that's why I'm distancing myself from saying that. I'm not making a halakhic statement here. I'm just saying like what my impression is. Yeah. Alrighty. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for coming. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.